resources and land that wouldn't otherwise be used unless the government was subsidizing those. And last point, I guess I might as well, let me just, since this seems to be the focus of our debate, I'll touch on this just very briefly. You hear a lot of call about a balanced approach, which of course is just a way of saying, let's increase revenue that the government controls. So do a little bit of a thought experiment that if you had a very good friend who was completely maxed on her credit cards, heavily in debt, spending 43 cents or borrowing 43 cents of every dollar that she spent, and wanted to come to you for advice and a plan about how to get out of debt. But first, she wanted to open up another credit card account. That's the position that Congress is really in. They seem to be negotiating by saying, let us borrow more, let us have more money first, and then we'll get our spending under control. So until the super committee can find a pathway, and I think this report shows a good way to start, is a path towards controlling spending before allowing politicians in Washington, D.C. to have access to more of our money, more of our resources.
Thank you. And Ryan, would you agree with Paul that all subsidies are bad?
We definitely look at subsidies skeptically. So, you know, I'm not sure there's a subsidy we've met that we like, but there are definitely subsidies we like less than others. Our priority institutionally is to go after the subsidies for the oldest and most profitable industries first. That's our first priority. They're the most expensive. They've been getting the money for the longest time. If you were going to try to level the playing field to kind of take 100 years of oil and gas subsidies and say, you know, okay, well, you can have, 5 years of subsidy over here at wind, is kind of absurd. But at the same time, I don't think we would say that the response is let's give 100 years to new and emerging technologies. I think the issue with subsidies in the context of energy, and I think this is a very complex area, one is, you know, if you look across the globe, there's a lot of state involvement in the energy sector. So I think we wouldn't say that it's practical to say that there's no state involvement in the energy sector. That said, if you take nuclear power, we have, you know, clearly as a country, we value free market principles. People want, you know, innovative businesses to succeed. Nuclear power basically exists in fully socialized energy sectors in Japan and France and Finland. And yet we continue to have really bipartisan support for the kinds of subsidies that it gets as an industry, despite, you know, if you own a nuclear power that's already operating, you look like a very profitable company today until you have, you know, God forbid, an accident. But building them, you just can't do it without massive, massive government support, and that's, I think, just not the right way to go. So I think that we look at every subsidy skeptically. We're going to start with the oldest and biggest first.
Okay, Ross, back to you. What do you think would happen to the alternative energy, the newer forms of alternative energy, if all subsidies were simply cut and the market was allowed to control it?
Well, first I start with what I was saying. You know, the visible subsidies, the direct tax support, the expenditures, the liability relief are dwarfed by the subsidies that we provide, putting our military budget so much at the service of the fossil fuel companies, allowing fossil fuel industry to use our atmosphere and our water as a free dumping ground. And you have 100+ years of vested development being woven into the fabric of our society, creating the interstate highway system, building our cities around that. So simply saying, all right, we're going to remove these visible subsidies from both, and then we're going to expect that the marketplace is going to allow these new things that many of us think are important, and which, you know, the energy sector has always been driven by public policy. It's always been driven by subsidies, and so we'd be kidding ourselves to say that hasn't happened. To say that we're just going to remove all that, it's going to float to a new place, we'd be kidding ourselves. And so I think we need to be smart. I think we need to be focused. I think we do need to remove subsidies from long-term profitable industries. But we need to recognize that the key issue is, again, investment, competitiveness, and building an infrastructure for the future economy. Many of these areas, I mean, talking that the private sector's driven all innovation just isn't true. Look at the computer industry.
I didn't say all innovation.
I'm just saying, but normally that's how it is characterized. The Defense Department, for example, has been a huge driver in building our computer industry, building the internet, building the infrastructure for a lot of research and development, which has then gotten implemented in critical areas. And we've had to make choices, sometimes better than others, about how we move those forward. But we strongly believe that we as a society need to be investing in ways that we can be competitive in a new economy. Look, we're going to be getting off of fossil fuels, and we're going to be paying the piper for our addiction at some point. Let's get ahead of that, and let's find ways efficiently to invest in what we need to be doing.
Okay, thank you. Did you, okay, you want to add something? Thank
Can I
you.
just pull this back a little bit? What government essentially is the framework by which we as a community and we as a nation invest our shared resources in public priorities and things that we want to achieve. And we have a range of tools for achieving our priorities. Some of them are achieved through the budget process, others are achieved through the tax code. So I think part of the problem here, and one of the reasons why this Green Scissors report is so important, is that we have these rigorous structures to go through the budget process. We have the GAO, or the Government Accountability Office, at the national level. Here at the state level, we have our state auditor. We have the Joint Legislative, JLARC. I'm trying to remember what the full acronym is. But anyway, we subject budgeted things that are gone through the appropriation process to a rigorous degree of scrutiny. But we don't do that so much on the what we call the tax expenditure side, or the tax break side, that these things wind up getting pushed into the tax code, and they just kind of stay there and are allowed to stay there year after year, and we don't assess their performance on the way that we do budgeted things. But if you have a policy that could easily be carried out by an appropriated expenditure or through the tax code, don't you want to measure those and their performance in the same way? So I wouldn't say that we at the Budget and Policy Center are against all tax breaks or tax expenditures, but we do support measuring them and assessing their effectiveness in the same way that we do with on-budget expenditures. So for example, we are big fans of the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is, research has shown to be very effective. It lifts people out of poverty. It encourages work. Dollars are spent locally. It stimulates the economy. But I would, and this is in some ways a weird example because it technically is on budget, but we should apply scrutiny to that investment. I want to know that those dollars are being spent wisely. So I think, from our perspective, it's about a system and a process in which we can balance our priorities and the tools for achieving those priorities in the same way. And I think that's sort of what we're moving to here, and what we're all kind of discussing is sort of the broader issue here.
Thank you. And Paul, I was going to ask you if you could briefly just address for us here, who are not policy wonks, the difference between tax expenditures and budget expenditures.
Okay, now you're getting me worked up here. Because I had a note to address this question, and this is a perfect way to do it. So I would, really as an analyst, I would object to the phrase tax expenditure, because I don't see a citizen not paying taxes as a cost to the government. So I'll make a philosophical point, and that is, my main objection to that phrase is that it seems to carry the assumption that the government has the right to all of your money, and then they just allow you to keep some of it. How generous of them. Whereas I think the real model in society, and it is true, people come together and form government in civil society. Taxes are important to make civil society function and to provide a safety net and to provide for the national defense and all the essential things that government does in order to make our communities possible. So we have to pay taxes for that. The way I think of it, though, is we choose representatives. Those representatives debate openly, vote on the record, and then choose what financial burden they are going to place on us to create the taxes that we pay that make society necessary. So I don't agree with the bookkeeping function that giving a tax break is, quote, a tax expenditure. However, I will rapidly agree that loopholes and breaks, or tax preferences, sometimes they're called, I serve on a state commission of tax preferences, is exactly, I think, what Green Scissors is trying to get at. And that's really another way of saying that the fairest kind of tax system is one that has low, consistent rates, a few rates that's progressive, but very few exceptions. And the reason is The fewer exceptions makes it harder for corporations and lobbyists and special interests to game the system, or to go to Congress and say, well, yeah, make my competitors pay taxes and not me. Another way to look at this concept is there's a constant pressure within government to privatize profit and socialize risk. So if my business enterprise makes money, then I get to keep that. If my enterprise loses money, well, that's on the Treasury. And that's what things like loan guarantees and subsidies do. One practical solution I would have, and we've talked about it on the state commission that I'm a member of, is putting time limits on tax subsidies. So after 3 years or 5 years, they would automatically expire. That way, the petroleum industry or mining industry wouldn't automatically have a tax break that lasts 100 years. That the legislative body, whether it's state or Congress, would revisit that policy every once in a while and say, does it make sense to continue to have a special provision of the tax code for this group? But overall, whether it makes sense or not, the fewer tax expenditures, tax preferences, I mean, I like the word tax break or loophole, which shows that that's special treatment that somebody's getting, and that therefore creates greater cost for the rest of us. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you. I just want to shift ground just a little bit and talk about Washington State for a moment. The Columbia River crossing was one of the items listed in the Green Scissors report. So I guess I'll start this out by addressing it to Ryan. This apparently was $3.5 billion in federal funds that we would have to give up. It would be new construction, jobs, economic growth, et cetera. Can you tell me why this one, can you talk specifically about this particular project?
I can talk a little bit about this specific project, and I'll let others closer to home fill in. But I think this is the kind of project that we look at as an example of it. You know, keep in mind the groups that agreed that this project was problematic. You know, it's very expensive. There are less expensive alternatives. You know, we're not in a moment of necessarily buying the most expensive bridge. Also, from the studies that we collectively looked at, it wouldn't do what they said it was going to do. It wouldn't reduce congestion. It would reduce commuting times by less than a minute, and congestion would be back at the same levels within 20 years, and it was likely to encourage sprawl. So that was those were the kinds of factors that made everybody at the table go, yeah, this does not look like a good deal for the federal taxpayer. It looks like they need to be a little more careful about the planning, a little more thoughtful, and come up with a less expensive alternative that's going to have fewer environmental impacts.
Thank you. And Ross, do you agree with that?
Well, I agree that we should be applying all of this analysis to major infrastructure projects into our spending and looking for the most environmentally appropriate, the best energy and carbon reducing ways to get what we need. And, you know, we would agree, we're not involved in the details of the Columbia River Crossing project and know there's strong voices at each side. And there's already been a lot of effort to try to reach an appropriate compromise there, and we have no idea whether they've gotten there. We'd like to see something that, you know, that involves maximizing transit, minimizes issues of sprawl, helps ensure that we're looking at all modes of transportation, and that is as cheap as possible to accomplish those goals. That being said, I think a critical thing is that it's often, I think it is a mistake to look at projects like that and say, okay, we don't like some aspects of this project, there's $3.5 billion we can eliminate. Because we have an infrastructure crisis in this country. We have a lot of aging, decaying infrastructure that's critical to our prosperity, critical to our way of life. We want to shape that in ways that position us for the future as well as possible, and again, minimize expenditures. But just saying, all right, we're not going to spend for those kind of things, I think is exactly the opposite approach that our competitors around the world are taking, who are leaping ahead of us in jobs and competitiveness. And so whether it's the Columbia River Crossing, whether it's the 520 bridge, whether it's dealing with aging dams or our grid infrastructure for electric transmission, we need to recognize there aren't easy solutions, and that we need to be able to have money for adequate investment in the kind of sustainable prosperity that we need to see.
Thank you. And Andy, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?